I will somehow continue on the same path as the previous speakers, but I will also try to give a different perspective, somewhat adding, but maybe also in some extent conflicting. As Per Espen said, I mean, the point here is a change for sure in technology, and it's very important. And it has been, I would say, almost exclusively the focus of most of the debate and most of the thinking. My perspective is that while it is very important, a green economy would imply not only technological changes, but also changes in institutions, partly to foster the kind of technological change that we think are the best, but also in a sense to try to think more in a macro perspective on what is actually happening here, because it's not only about technological change. To be a little provocative, one can say that we are actually now, with the existing institutions in the economy, we are actually caught in a catch-22 situation. Simply saying that if we continue growing, and that means, in my sense, also increased material use, the economy will create an environmental disaster. We don't know when and we don't know how, but we already see signs of it. But on the other hand, if we stop growing, the growth in itself is a motivation for investment. And investment is driving the economy. So certainly it's very important in the present situation to continue grow, to avoid social catastrophes or disasters, in the sense of what we already see in parts of Europe with high unemployment rates. To me, the main issue here is actually how to get out of this impossible choice. And it's not easy, but I will try to give a little bit of my thinking about this. And I will start with thinking about the system in which we are operating as the Mother Earth, with its biosphere, which is actually constructed and developing itself on the basis of sun energy, and demands also that we are able to export a similar amount of heat to make the system in balance. In that system, humans over the last centuries, or maybe millennia, you would say, have developed this economy in the sense of using resources from the nature. Let me see, sorry, I'm one behind, I didn't see that, sorry. In the sense that what happens here is that we create production units and we are also consumers, and we typically use markets to communicate between the two. And this is fine. But there are still issues that we are facing in this, and we try to then construct institutions to somehow foster production, to somehow control the relationship between production and consumption, and also its effect on the environment. We know from very simple physical knowledge that what comes in has to come out. So the red arrows sum up to the green one, but in different forms, and sometimes not a problem at all, but in other situations, creating really big problems for the biosphere and its functioning. And in this interdependent system, if I may call it that, every action is linked to any other action. Every person's action is also influencing the opportunities for others. Maybe in small, but it adds up through the effects on the environment. And the more the economy grows in material terms, certainly the more it infringes upon the functioning of the biosphere. There is also very important that there is no automatic feedback to the economic actions from these influences on each other's environment. We could hope that people see this and take responsibility or find new opportunities, but there is nothing in this structure that gives the feedback. And historically, what we see is the effect of that is that we are moving the economy into the biosphere out of its bounds. I'm saying loss of biodiversity is actually seen as a worse problem than climate change, even though that is mainly focused so far here, and it's in itself a very important issue also. But the idea here is, how can you think about economic expansion without moving beyond the so-called green space? And I think the green economy problem is actually keeping ourselves within that space and doing it in a solidarity-based way. I mentioned institutions. What do I mean by institutions? Well, simply rules. Conventions, norms, and legal rules that regulate the relationship between us, what we can, want, and should do. And these are socially constructed, we say. I mean, they are made by people, but they also influence who we are and who we become. Our identity is very much defined by the norms of the culture in which we are raised and in which we take part in its development. And it's very important here to think about these kinds of rules also as sets of rules, in the sense that we have different roles. Some of you here are professors, teachers, some are CEOs, some represent or are workers, construction workers maybe, whatever you do. All these kind of professions have their professional codes and their kind of motivation structures. Why do we do what we do? And very much of our actions follow from such kind of institutional influence. What I have been doing and working with other people is to try to think and systematize a bit the different ways we think when we act. We say that the human is egoistic. Well, I think there is a great kind of knowledge that is right when we refer to that. We refer to that as the focus on what is good for me. And certainly we also have built institutions that foster such kind of rationality. That is very much the dynamics of the market that fosters this kind of rationality. But we also see that people may care. And I think it's wrong to say that we are universally egoistic. I think it's a lot of research showing now that we are able to also think in terms of consequences for the other or what is better for the group. And this kind of we or they focus is related to concepts of the more normative, appropriate behavior. And the point here is that the institutions, they define what rationality is expected in the situation, because it's very difficult for people, in a sense, to think about what should I do now in a complex situation with many other people. Can I care about myself? Or should I also think about the interests of others? So we create different type of institutional structures to solve that problem. One of the problems with the present economy is that the balance is wrong, I tend to think, and it has to be shifted. To illustrate my point, just let me use an example here. There is a lot of research showing all of these kind of different dynamics, and they are culturally specific, and it's quite a rich and quite a diverse type of understanding. But just let me use an example from something that almost everybody here has been part of, and that is what we do in high school when we collect money for a charity. Operasjon Dagsverk, we call it in Norwegian. This is a research done in Israel in high schools that did the same. But what they were after was to look at the motivation for doing this. I mean, over years, people have collected money for charity by working in the gardens of people or whatever way they collected money. And they did this for free, one day each year. The point was, what happens if you then start paying people? Because you give an extra incentive to collect money or work for money. What they did was to actually divide the students in 3 groups. One that did as before, one that got 1% of what they collected for their own pocket, and one that got 10% from their own pocket. From simple economic theory, you would first of all expect people not to collect money for free. So I mean, even the start here raises a question. But what this research shows is that, yes, no, people without any incentive, they collect money. The point was, when you pay people, this happens. If you pay people more, this happens. So in a sense, economic theory is right. The more you incentivize, the more we do. But the big issue is, why don't people think about zero pay as bad pay while they think about 1% pay as bad pay? These are two different logics, aren't they? They are two different institutional structures about what is appropriate behavior. And they are both functioning in their context. Environmental problems, and I have already mentioned several of them, they exist because of an effect of a high number of independent choices, that all of them can be seen as good. I'm not saying that we destroy the environment because we want. We destroy the environment because we try to do something that is good and that is important for us, but we have no way that we can also take the signals back in. And what I think is a big issue here, when we talk about green economy, we should talk about how we can reconnect those individual choices, and that is not easy. And I will use my last part of the talk to say a little bit about how that can be done. Carlotta already talked about, and also Paul talked even more, talked about technological change, and I have to repeat, it's important. But on its own, maybe not, because it might need, or I think it must need, or will need, a way of organizing this politically so that you can support the development of technological change. But I also think that we have to start now discussing how we can create an economy less dependent on expansion. So it's this kind of story that adds to what has already been talked about. And as difficult it seems, it's also easy to formulate. And that is that it has to depend on institutional change and specifically increase the role of social rationality in production and consumption. And that brings in collectives. That brings in states and communities. But it also has to do with the structure of firms. I will return to that. First of all, I will second Charlotta's point that we need collective direction. Because a path, coming onto a new path, implies combination of decisions by myriads of decision makers. And without direction, it will go in all kinds of directions. And the uncertainty that will be produced for the investors in such a situation will certainly make it very difficult to make big leaps. So big leaps demand that one takes decision. Should we go for that or that type of transition? And I think politicians have been far too afraid of taking lead in this process. And why politicians? That's because, at least in the ideal role, the politician is defined as an actor that has to think about what is better for the group, what is better for society. And we institute that by instituting the role of politicians. Okay, we have corruption. That means politicians that think about themselves. But culturally, politically, it is to develop the role of the politician, and I think Europe, Scandinavia has been quite well at doing that. So we have if I may talk of where we are in front, I think Scandinavia are in front exactly on that level. And investment is important, but we need investors that think in long term, which also means that maybe states and communities has to be engaged in investments. And I think Paul also, with his emphasis on the role of communities, actually was talking about that kind of dynamics. Many economists argue that you can solve this problem by taxing emissions. It's actually quite easy, technologically or technically, if you think about that it's only about fossil fuels. Just make it very expensive. But it's politically not very simple. And it's not very simple because there is all these kinds of interests that are linked to it. And relative prices are weak, actually, also, because you have to have direction, and relative prices give two weak signals for direction. And finally, how can we believe in a state that runs after all of these balls? All of these problems. So there is a more fundamental change at the level of firms and at the level of society. The way of thinking about this is that you can think about the nature, the biosphere, as being something that is protected by an attractor in which it is. The red ball here illustrates an ecosystem that is very resilient. You can do a lot of changes of it, and if you take away those external pushes, what happens is that it goes back to its original form. But we talk about thresholds, which means that an ecosystem can be pushed to a point where it actually are not able to move back to its original situation when the shock or the external influence is taken away. And in that situation, we are really in trouble, because we depend on the functioning of these systems. And acting precautionary, in my sense, implies not to push the effect of the economic system on its environments up against these thresholds. And that means that why should we talk so much about green growth? Why isn't it enough to be green? I mean, what is it culturally that demands of us to talk about it in growth terms? So there's huge changes. There will be growth in certain industries, but why does the economy necessarily have to grow in rich countries? I think we have to leave the space for those who need to grow, also in physical terms, those who are poor and have problems, as Charlotta also emphasized. So, the present strategy is to try to react to the emissions that comes out, and we run after these balls, and it takes 10s and 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s of years to able to recognize, to get it proven, and to get it accepted. And we have these interest lock-ins. I think it's an impossible institutional structure. I think there are two alternatives here. Seeing that the economy is growing, you could first of all regulate on it the inputs to the economy. And there are examples of that. I mean, fossil fuels taxes is actually an example, and there are other examples, but we should do it in a much more comprehensive way. Secondly, I think we need also to think about institutions that makes the economy less dependent on growth to avoid the social problems of unemployment. In my last two slides, I will have to be very brief, and it's just a sketch. But we are also in a situation where we don't know, because this is a dialogue between scientists and activists and people from business and policy. What I think is important to avoid this kind of development of economic collapse is, first of all, I would say that a further expansion in rich countries don't bring happiness. I agree with Charlotta that, yes, there is another way, but I'm not sure if the consumers are able to, in a sense, make that way on their own. I think we are puppets on the string. I see a lot of development, but it's still marginal. For me, the dynamics lies at the relationship with the logic of why firms do what firms do, and the situation in the international competition. So what I've been thinking about is that if it was possible to make firms take more mission, be more socially rational, not only be motivated by the payback on the investments, I think it would be a huge step forward. A little bit more about that, but now I see I have very little time, so I will be quick, but still I hope you can follow me. There are different ways that social rationality can be instituted at the level of the firm. We tried thinking about the triple bottom line, not in the standard CSR way, but actually with ownership to each bottom line, and a situation where these interests actually play out at the level of the firm. We also see that firms experiment with a different mission. We have, also in Norway, but maybe more visible in other countries, what we call social environmental businesses, which are mission-driven, which try to do good, but still produce products, and try to produce products that live 2, 3, 4, 5 times longer than existing products. But they have a problem in the market. Who will buy this? And how can they finance their activities? I think one of the most important things is to look at how states could support these kinds of initiatives and learn about ways that businesses could be organized to more actually act for the common good and not only for their own good. But that demands actually a shift in the competition, what you call it, environment for businesses. I don't have time to go into it, but just one thing that bothers me is why do you first have free trade negotiations and then you pick up the problems afterwards with international environmental agreements? Why don't you try to combine the two so that you get a decent and reasonable and responsible kind of external framework for firms that wants to do good? It is a cultural project. It has to do with changing the minds of consumers. But I think it starts with the politicians, it starts with us as citizens, and it is the importance of firms and the way firms are motivated that I think shows the solution and shows the way. Thank you.